Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Ever dealt with an HOA that thinks they own you? Well, mine tried to seize control of my private driveway. They locked me out, so I locked them out, all 140 houses, and you won't believe what happened next. I live in a house my grandfather built. The man poured the foundation with his own hands back when the land around here was nothing but open fields and a dirt road that led nowhere in particular. The house is old, the kind of old that has character instead of just wear. 3 acres of it surrounded by mature oaks that have been dropping acorns on that same roof for 70-some years. Now, though, the view from my back porch is about 140 beige houses arranged in neat little rows, all of them built on land my grandparents sold to a developer back in the 80s. That developer needed access to the main road. The only sensible route was the long private driveway that connected my grandparents' property to the highway. A winding half-mile strip of land that cuts through a stretch of old trees before opening up at the entrance gate. My grandparents agreed to sell the surrounding acreage but kept the house, the 3 acres immediately around it, and the driveway itself. What the developer got, and what eventually transferred to the HOA that governs the neighborhood, was an easement. The legal right to use the road. Not to own it, not to control it, not to modify it, just to use it. This distinction matters. It is going to matter a lot before this story is over. The entrance to the property is marked by a wrought iron gate that my grandfather installed sometime in the 60s. It's not ornate or fancy, just heavy, functional, and solid in a way that newer things rarely are. During the day, I leave it open. At night, I close it and run a chain through the bars and clip my personal padlock through the links. It's been the routine for as long as I can remember living here, which at this point is most of my adult life. For a long time, the arrangement worked fine. The neighborhood came and went through the gate, people were polite, and the HOA stayed in their lane. There were minor irritations over the years, little comments here and there about whether my property fit the aesthetic of the community, but nothing that crossed any serious lines. Then, about 14 months ago, the HOA held elections and a new president took over. I'll be honest, I noticed the shift almost immediately, not because anything dramatic happened right away, but because of the tone. She started what I can only describe as a campaign of aggressive friendliness that had a very clear edge underneath it. She showed up at my door once in the early weeks to introduce herself and to mention, almost as a footnote, that she had some ideas about unifying the entrance aesthetic of the neighborhood. I was polite. I told her the gate and the driveway were private property under an easement arrangement and that any changes to the entrance would require my consent. She smiled in that way people smile when they've decided they're not really listening to you, said something vague about looking forward to working together, and left. After that came the notices. Not about the gate at first, but about everything adjacent to it. The strip of gravel on my side of the property line was apparently inconsistent with community standards. The style of the reflective markers I had on my fence posts was not in line with the neighborhood guidelines. None of these things had anything to do with the HOA's jurisdiction because my property was explicitly outside it, but the notices kept coming. I saved every single one of them, not because I was planning anything at the time, just because something in my gut told me I should keep records of this particular person's behavior. What I didn't anticipate was how far she was willing to go. It was a Tuesday evening in October when it happened. I'd had a long day, nothing catastrophic, just the kind of long day that makes you want to get home, eat something, and stop thinking about other people's problems. I was driving the last stretch of county road before my turnoff when I spotted the gate in my headlights and immediately knew something was wrong. The gate was closed. That alone wasn't the issue, since sometimes the wind pushes it a few degrees and it settles into a near-closed position. But as I got closer and my headlights swept across the bars properly, I could see that it wasn't just closed. It was locked, and the lock wasn't mine. I pulled up close and got out of the car. My padlock and chain were gone. In their place was a heavy combination lock, the kind with a thick shackle attached through the bars. There was a small plastic tag zip-tied to it. The tag had text on it in black marker that read something to the effect of "Property of the HOA," along with what appeared to be a code number for their records. I stood there in the headlights for a moment. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment because I think people sometimes imagine that in situations like this you go immediately to rage. I didn't. What I felt was something colder than that. It was the feeling of watching someone make an enormous mistake while being completely convinced they're being clever. My heart rate actually slowed down. I took a breath, looked at the lock, looked at the tag, and thought clearly about what I was going to do. The first instinct was to get something to cut the lock off and deal with it later. I had a pair of bolt cutters in the bed of my truck. The second instinct, the one I listened to, was to not touch anything yet. I got my phone out and started documenting. I took wide shots of the entire gate showing the lock in context, then close-up shots of the lock itself and the tag, making sure the text on the tag was legible in the photos. Then I switched to video and recorded a short clip where I narrated calmly, stating the date, the time, my address, and a description of what I was looking at. I mentioned that my personal lock had been removed and replaced without my knowledge or consent. I mentioned the HOA tag. I kept my voice neutral, the way you'd talk to a doctor when you're describing symptoms. Factual, detailed, without emotion. Then I got back in my truck and parked on the county road shoulder just outside the gate, turned on my hazard lights, and started making calls. I did not call the HOA president directly. That was a deliberate choice. Calling her would have created a private conversation with no record and given her the chance to manage the narrative in whatever direction suited her. Instead, I called the HOA management company, the third-party company that handles the administrative side of the neighborhood's operations. I introduced myself, gave my address, and explained in very clear terms that I was currently locked out of my own private property because an unauthorized lock bearing an HOA tag had been placed on my gate without my consent. I told them my personal lock had been removed, also without consent. I asked them to provide me with the name of the person who had authorized the action and to arrange for the lock's removal that evening. The representative I reached sounded genuinely confused, which told me this had not gone through any formal process on their end. She said she would look into it and get back to me. I thanked her, told her I would be following up with written correspondence, and ended the call. Then I sat in my truck and drafted an email on my phone. It went to the full HOA board, the management company, and I BCC'd my personal email address to create a time-stamped copy. The subject line was straightforward, something along the lines of, "Unauthorized lock placed on private property, immediate removal required." In the body, I laid out the facts in short, clear sentences. I stated that I was the legal owner of the property on which the gate was located, that the HOA held only an easement granting use of the driveway with no ownership or modification rights, that an unauthorized lock had been placed on the gate preventing access to my private residence, and that this constituted both trespassing and unlawful obstruction of access. I attached the photos and the video. I requested removal of the lock within 24 hours. I stated plainly that if it was not removed within that window, I would hire a professional to remove it at the HOA's expense and would pursue any additional legal remedies available to me. I sent the email. Then I called a neighbor who lived just outside the neighborhood on the other side and asked if I could use their driveway to turn around and access my property from the back service road for the night. They said, of course, no problem. I parked my truck, went home through the back way, made myself dinner, and went to bed. I slept fine, which surprised me later when I thought about it. But I think once you've done everything correctly and documented everything properly and set the clock ticking on someone else's mistake, there's nothing left to be anxious about. The situation was going to resolve itself one way or another. The reply came the next morning, and it was better than I could have hoped for. The HOA president had sent a response to the entire board thread, which meant her reply went to everyone I had originally emailed. She had not, apparently, thought carefully about what she was putting in writing. The email was written in a tone I can only describe as cheerfully condescending. She explained that the board had decided to upgrade the gate's locking system for security and community uniformity. She said my old chain was an eyesore that didn't reflect the neighborhood's standards. She provided the combination code for the new lock so that I could, as she put it, use the gate like everyone else. She closed by saying this was now official HOA policy and that she looked forward to my cooperation. I read that email 3 times. I saved it to 3 separate locations on my devices and forwarded a copy to my personal cloud storage. I also printed it and added it to a folder I had already started labeling with the date the incident began. She had just put into writing, on a documented email thread, a full admission that she had intentionally placed a lock on property she did not own, removed my personal property without my consent, and declared it policy, without any legal authority to do so. She had done this while apparently believing she was in the right. People in my life have asked me since then why I didn't feel a rush of excitement or satisfaction when I read that email. The honest answer is that by that point I was past excitement. I was in a different mode entirely. There's a kind of focus that takes over when you realize the other side has made a catastrophic error and handed you everything you need. It's not fun exactly. It's more like the feeling of a chess game where you can already see checkmate 12 moves ahead and now you're just playing it out. I forwarded the email to a real estate attorney I had used a couple of years earlier when there had been a minor boundary dispute with the county. I included all the other documentation and gave her a full summary of the situation. She replied within a few hours saying the HOA president's email was essentially a gift and that my position was extremely strong. She advised me to let the 24-hour deadline pass without any further negotiation and then to proceed with lock removal and next steps. The deadline passed, the lock was still there. During those 24 hours, something else was happening that I had not entirely anticipated. Other residents were starting to feel the effects of the situation. People who had been coming and going through that gate every day for years now had to use a combination they'd only just received, which some of them hadn't seen because they don't read HOA emails closely. A couple of them came around to my back entrance looking confused, having seen my truck parked back there, wanting to know what was going on at the front gate. I was honest with them. I told them the HOA had placed an unauthorized lock on my private property without my consent, and that I was in the process of resolving it through legal channels. I told them I was genuinely sorry for the inconvenience this was causing. I suggested that if they were frustrated, the best thing to do was contact the HOA board directly and let them know how they felt. I said this pleasantly and without any drama. I wasn't trying to stir anyone up. But the effect of telling the truth to reasonable people who are already inconvenienced is that they tend to get appropriately frustrated on your behalf, and that frustration tends to go exactly where it should. By that evening, there were a number of posts in the neighborhood's online community group about the gate situation. People were asking what was happening, why the combination suddenly changed, why the entrance looked different. Someone posted a photo of the new lock. Someone else replied that they'd heard there was a dispute with the property owner. I did not participate in any of these conversations, I just watched. The next morning, I called a locksmith. I explained the situation to the locksmith before he came out. I told him I was the property owner, that an unauthorized lock had been placed on my private gate by a third party, and that I needed it professionally removed and documented. I specifically asked that his invoice describe the service as the emergency removal of an unauthorized locking device from a private residence. He was a practical man who had clearly dealt with stranger situations than this. He said he could be there within 2 hours. When he arrived, I showed him the documentation I had. The photos, the email, the original property records showing my ownership. He looked everything over, nodded, and got to work. The HOA's lock was off in about 4 minutes. He set it aside carefully, and I photographed it lying on the ground next to the gate, still tagged with the HOA's label, freshly removed. He wrote up his invoice exactly as I had requested, including the time, date, and description of what had been removed and why. Then I installed my new lock. Not the old chain and padlock setup, but something considerably more substantial. A hardened steel chain rated for industrial use with a high security padlock that would take serious equipment and a long time to defeat. I locked the gate. I stepped back and looked at it. The gate was closed, locked with my lock, and was going to stay that way until I decided otherwise. I went back inside and prepared the notice. My attorney had helped me draft the language the night before. I printed it in large, clear text, laminated it at a copy shop that morning on my way to meet the locksmith, and now I taped it to the front of the gate where it was impossible to miss. The notice stated that due to an unauthorized security breach and tampering with the access control system on private property by the HOA, the entrance was temporarily closed to all traffic pending resolution of the matter. It directed all inquiries to the HOA Board of Directors. It was signed with my full name and identified me as the property owner. I walked back up the driveway to my house, made coffee, and sat on the porch. The first 45 minutes were quiet. Then my phone started going. The management company called twice. I sent both calls to voicemail and listened to the messages later. The first was from the same representative I'd spoken to before, sounding considerably less composed than she had 2 days ago. The second was from someone higher up in the management company, a supervisor type, who asked me to call back urgently to discuss the situation. I called my attorney instead and told her what I'd done. She said the move was legally sound given my ownership rights and the documented trespass, and that I should not open the gate or communicate with the HOA directly without running it past her first. She said to let the pressure build for a bit and see what came to us. That was fine with me. What came to us about 2 hours later was a scene I genuinely was not expecting in terms of the sheer spectacle of it. I could hear the commotion before I saw anyone. Voices, more than one, coming up the driveway from the direction of the fence line where there's a gap people sometimes used as a footpath. I stepped out onto the porch and watched 3 people come around the side of my house and walk up toward me. The HOA president was at the front, and she had 2 board members flanking her like she was walking into a negotiation she intended to win. I want to note that they had technically just walked onto my private property without being invited. I also note this because I wrote it down in my record of events that afternoon. I stayed on the porch. I had my coffee. I let them come to me. When they got close enough, I held up one hand before anyone could speak, not rudely, just firmly, and I told them calmly that I was happy to discuss the situation, but that this conversation needed to be brief, civil, and I would be taking notes. I told them I also wanted them to know I had my attorney on call. The president started to say something about how this had gone too far and was I really going to inconvenience the entire neighborhood over a lock. I waited for her to finish and then I laid out my terms. I told her and the 2 board members exactly what needed to happen before that gate was going to open again. I was specific and I did not rush through it. First, I needed immediate reimbursement for the locksmith's invoice. I had a copy of the invoice with me and I showed it to her. Second, I needed a formal written apology from the full board, not a casual note, a proper documented statement acknowledging that the HOA had trespassed on private property and overstepped its authority under the easement agreement. Third, that apology needed to be sent at the HOA's cost to every household in the community so that the nature of the property arrangement was on record for every resident. Fourth, I needed a legally binding agreement that the HOA would not touch, modify, or place anything on the gate or the driveway without my prior written consent. That agreement would be drafted or reviewed by my attorney at the HOA's expense. The president's reaction moved through several stages in the span of about 30 seconds. First, there was disbelief, then something that looked like it wanted to be outrage, and then she said she was going to call the police and also that she intended to sue me for disrupting the community. I told her she was welcome to do both. I told her calmly that when the police arrived, I would show them the property records, the original easement documentation, the photos and video from the night the HOA lock appeared, the email she had sent admitting to placing the lock intentionally, the certified mail delivery confirmation showing the HOA had received and ignored my demand letter, and the locksmith's invoice. I told her that what she had done had a specific legal name and it was called trespassing, and that what she was doing right now on my property without invitation had a name too. I told her my attorney was available to explain all of this in more technical language if she preferred. One of the board members, not the president, said something quiet to the others. I couldn't hear all of it, but the word easement was in there. He looked at me and asked if I actually had all of that documentation in hand. I said yes. He asked if the attorney was actually on standby. I said yes. He looked at the president. There was a long pause. She said she needed to consult with the board before agreeing to anything. I said that was completely reasonable and that I hoped the consultation would go quickly because every hour the gate was closed was an hour her residents were telling each other why it was closed. I told her to have the board reach out to my attorney's office and that we would move from there. I gave her the attorney's business card. They left. The chaos of that day was something I only pieced together fully afterward from a combination of what my attorney told me and what residents later mentioned when I talked to them. Apparently, things inside the neighborhood had been building steadily since the gate closed that morning. The school buses couldn't get in through the main entrance and had to reroute. A few people who had early work shifts had parked outside and walked in. Package deliveries were piling up outside the gate. Someone's grocery order got canceled because the driver couldn't access the address. The neighborhood online group was going in circles trying to figure out what was happening and whose fault it was, and a fairly unified answer was starting to emerge from the people who had talked to me at my back gate the previous day. By early afternoon, the HOA board had received enough phone calls and messages from residents that the president apparently called an emergency board meeting. My attorney got a call from the management company at around 4 o'clock, expressing that the board was ready to discuss terms. My attorney's response was that the terms had already been communicated directly by me and that there was nothing to discuss, only to agree to or not agree to. They agreed, all 4 points, in full. The reimbursement check was certified and hand-delivered to my attorney's office 2 days later. The written apology from the board was drafted, reviewed by my attorney to confirm it said exactly what I had required it to say, and then mailed to every household in the community. I have a copy of that letter. It acknowledges clearly that the HOA placed a lock on private property without the owner's consent, that the HOA's authority under the easement agreement does not extend to ownership or modification rights over the entrance or the driveway, and that the board regrets the disruption caused to residents. It is signed by the full board. The legally binding agreement was drafted with input from my attorney and signed within the week. It specifies in clear language that the HOA will not place, install, modify, or otherwise interfere with any lock, sign, structure, or fixture on the gate or the driveway without my prior written consent. It includes a clause about the consequences of violation. My attorney called it one of the cleaner property agreement addendums she had put together in recent years, which I took as a compliment to the clarity of the situation. I opened the gate the morning the check cleared. I took the laminated notice down, folded it up, and put it in the same folder with everything else from the incident. Then I unlocked the gate and pushed it open. I left it open that whole day, which is what I normally do. The cars started coming and going again. A few people waved at me as they passed. One man I had spoken to at the back gate during the closure slowed down and gave me a thumbs up through his window. I nodded at him and went back inside. The HOA meeting that happened about 3 weeks later is where the final chapter of this particular saga played out. I was not at the meeting. I heard about it from 2 different residents afterward, and their accounts match closely enough that I'm confident in the outline of what happened. The president faced significant pushback from the community. The letter that had gone to every household had done what I intended it to do, which was to make the facts of the situation undeniable and public. People who hadn't known the precise details of the property arrangement before now knew them clearly. People who had been mildly inconvenienced during the closure were now fully aware of why it had happened and who was responsible. There was a motion to remove her from the position of board president. I've been told the vote wasn't close. She stayed on the board in a reduced capacity for a while, a few months I think, and then she was gone entirely. I have not had a single piece of correspondence from the HOA that references my property, my gate, or my driveway in any context other than routine maintenance coordination since the agreement was signed. The maintenance they're responsible for under the easement, the paving, the snow clearing in winter, gets done on schedule. I get a short notice a day or 2 before any work is planned. That's exactly how it's supposed to work, and that is exactly how it now works. The residents I interact with regularly are friendly in a different way than they used to be. It's not warmer exactly, just more straightforward. People know what this property is and who owns what. There's no ambiguity about it anymore, and I think that actually makes the relationship easier for everyone. When someone passes through the gate and gives me a wave, it doesn't feel like the polite performance it sometimes felt like before. It feels like acknowledgement. They know I could close that gate. They know I won't, because I never wanted to in the first place. But they know. My attorney sent me a note after everything wrapped up. She said in about 15 years of practice, she had rarely seen a situation where someone had documented a trespass so thoroughly before doing anything about it, and that the documentation was what made every subsequent step as clean as it was. She said the president's email had been particularly useful since it removed any possibility of arguing that the lock placement was a misunderstanding or an error by a maintenance worker. It was a decision made by a named person who then wrote an email explaining the reasoning and defending it. There was no version of events that helped the HOA after that email existed. I thought about that a lot in the weeks after. I thought about the moment I was standing at the gate in the headlights of my truck and decided not to reach for the bolt cutters. That decision, made in about 10 seconds, is what made the difference between a dispute that got messy and loud and settled nothing, and a resolution that cost the HOA real money, real public accountability, and a legally binding agreement that protects my property rights permanently. Sometimes the best thing you can do when someone makes a move against you is to go very still, document everything, and let them keep moving. People who are convinced they have authority they don't actually have tend to keep pushing, and every push is another piece of evidence. The president didn't just put a lock on my gate. She sent an email defending it. She ignored a certified letter. She let the deadline pass. She showed up on my property uninvited. Every one of those things was a choice she made freely, and every one of them landed in my folder. The gate is mine. It always was. Every evening when I swing it closed and run the chain through and click my lock into place, I think about the fact that the entire surrounding community now has a letter in their homes explaining that. The HOA spent money to print and mail that letter. They spent money on my attorney's fees. They signed their names to an agreement that limits their authority in writing for as long as that easement exists. She wanted to control the entrance. She ended up funding the documentation of everything she was not allowed to do. The lock on the gate at the end of each day is mine. The satisfaction is mine too. And honestly, so is the driveway. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I'm 24, living in my first place on my own. I'd rented a townhouse, this was back in the late 80s, even when poor people could rent entire houses, and was putting myself through college. Not a lot of money to spare, but I was getting by. The townhouse was not detached, and I had 2 neighbors whose homes were directly attached to my own. I got along fine with my southernmost neighbor, aka we said hi when we saw each other and that was about it. But the other neighbor, he had a chip on his shoulder. Generally rude if we bumped into each other, I'd say hi or good morning. He'd ignore me, scowl, turn away, etc. Whatever, no big deal, I just took it in stride. Being a struggling college student, I didn't have a lot of money for non-essentials. Most of the people in the neighborhood poured weed killers on their lawns every spring. I didn't do this for several reasons. Most important, I think it's a shame to poison the local water table, and while I love a nice lawn, I don't think you have to cater to grass. I prefer a more natural look. Back then, that meant regular grass, but with some crabgrass and dandelions. One day Bob starts berating me over my dandelions. It doesn't fit the neighborhood. Don't you have any self-respect? You bring down the tone of the neighborhood. Every time he'd see me, he'd tell me I need to pour poison on my lawn, which I explained I couldn't afford and didn't want to do. At first I was polite as I wanted to be on good terms with my neighbors, but Bob started getting angrier and more unreasonable, started calling me poor white trash. One day I'm coming home, parking in my driveway with some friends from school in my car. As we're getting out, Bob comes outside and shouts at the top of his lungs, "Get rid of those ducking dandelions!" He looks over and now spots my friends getting out of the car, and he's clearly embarrassed, but he doubled down and started talking directly to my friends. "Did you know your friend is an embarrassment to the neighborhood? How's it feel to be friends with white trash?" I had just about had enough of his anger by then, and I snapped back, told him to duck off and mind his own business. Several days later, I get a knock on my front door, open up the door, and it's a bylaw enforcement officer. Says he's responding to complaints of noxious weeds in my backyard and asks to come take a look for himself. Being a middle unit, the only access to my backyard was through the house. I invite him in, offer him a drink of, which he gratefully accepts, hot day, and take him through to the backyard. Lots of lovely white and yellow dandelions peppered over the yard. He takes one look and gives a deep sigh. There were no noxious weeds, which I knew full well, as I had long ago taken the precaution of checking with the city to see what was and what was not acceptable in the weed department, and I knew I was well, very comfortably, within compliance. The bylaw cop apologized for wasting my time, said my yard was nowhere near a problem. He left and went next door to chastise my neighbor for wasting his time. I stood at my front door and listened. It was glorious listening to Bob sputtering and angry, trying to defend himself and vilify me, all to no avail. My wife and I can't even sit out and enjoy our backyard because of all those stupid dandelions. Bylaw cop told him to stop harassing his neighbors and left. But listening in gave me an idea. I knew Bob liked to sit out on his back deck in the afternoons, so I waited. As soon as I spotted him out there, I walked out into my backyard, ignoring Bob as I gathered up a nice bouquet of white-topped dandelions, seeds ready to disperse to the wind. We had a 4-foot-high chain-link fence between our properties, so the view between yards was pretty much unobstructed. I stood at the fence, locked eyes with Bob, and started blowing thousands of dandelion seeds into his yard. The wind was at my back, so the seeds were traveling quite far into his yard. He grew red-faced and started yelling at me. "What's the matter, Bob? I'm just doing what you asked and getting rid of my dandelions." He yelled more, and I just ignored him. After depositing several dandelions worth of seeds, he went back inside. From that day forward, for the next several weeks, every single time I saw him out on his deck, I'd go out and send more dandelion seeds into his yard. Eventually, dandelion flowering season ended. I wanted to think that Bob learned a lesson about bullying, but he didn't. I'll post some of his other bullying attempts at some other time. The next one is an entitled People story. I worked in electrical retail in a mall in England back when the Wii console first came out. When it was first released, if you are old enough, You'll remember that the handsets didn't come with a safety strap attached at all. You just held it in your hand loose to play the games. It had a thin strap with it, but no one ever attached them. So about 3 days after the release of the Wii, a couple came into the store literally carrying their big LED TV, seriously high-tech at the time and very pricey, under their arm and put it on the counter of customer services and demanded to see the manager. Sadly, this was before the Karen name tag existed. We asked them what the problem was, and they pointed to the giant crack on the TV screen and said it had just mysteriously broken. We said that unless they had an extra warranty, that accidental damage was not covered. They replied all snootily that the TV just broke. The kid with them sniggered. They refused to talk more unless to a manager. It was busy, so he'd be a while. I told them to browse. They left the kid with me. Gee, thanks. So I chatted a bit to the kid till I softened him up. Then I straight up asked the kid, 9 or so, what really happened. He said, well, I was using my new Wii and the remote flew out of my hand whilst I was playing 10-pin bowling and it crashed into the screen on the wall and smashed it. I was utterly astounded. Luckily, a coworker had also heard what the kid said. At that point, the manager came up to me and before the parents could come storming back over, I quickly told him the real story. Then the parents arrived and began to bullcrap the manager utterly. The screen just broke whilst we were out. Manager was a good bloke and said, well, your kid just told us that the Wii remote flew out of his hand into the screen. Cue parents looking at the kid like he was gonna be grounded for a year. The kid was still smirking, as 9-year-old lil craps are bound to do when getting someone else into trouble. Whilst this was going on, I actually had taken the time to look at the back of the TV and saw that it wasn't even a model number that we sold. I quickly turned to my manager and said, this TV isn't even one we sell here. The manager looked at parents and asked what exactly they thought we could do if the telly wasn't from this store. They both started yelling over each other, saying that it was all our fault and that they shouldn't have to replace it, but still trying to say nothing about the Wii. Our manager stonily said that there was literally nothing we could do as they hadn't even bought it from us, so how could we replace it? They were both so crossed lines and agitated that they started being utter Karens and crafty at us. I could tell manager was 5 seconds from calling mall security when the dad said, well, we bought the Wii from you and that was what caused the accident, so you have to replace it. Ah, so you do admit it was an accident caused by your kid on his Wii? The parents both just looked at each other and the mum looked so pissed at dad. And the mum took the kid's wrist and went to storm out of the shop shouting at dad to follow them. My manager called after them, hey, you can't leave the TV here, but it's littering! I think he just pulled that out of nowhere because he was utterly pissed off by that point. If you leave the TV here, we'll contact mall security and you'll be banned from the entire mall. There were other malls in the city, but ours was the biggest with all the best stores. Dad just huffs and comes to retrieve it and they both get escorted out of the store by our own security. A few weeks later, Nintendo sent out stickers to put on all the Wii boxes to always attach a safety strap. And a few months later, all Wii remotes started being shipped with straps attached already. I think there were a lot of broken TVs at this point, but I bet we were the only store to have a couple ask for a new TV at a store they never even bought it from. Anyway, thank you for watching.